Good afternoon, or good morning to our friends joining us from Oz, and welcome to everyone. My name is Jane Lute. I'm a member of the board of the Atlantic Council, and on behalf of the Atlantic Council and the Cyber Statecraft Initiative within the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you to today's discussion on critical partnerships for cybersecurity. The Atlantic Council promotes constructive leadership and engagement in international affairs based on the Atlantic community's central role in meeting global challenges. Within the Council, the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security works with partners and allies to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and the world. In particular, the Scowcroft Center has worked to increase constructive U.S. engagement on emerging security challenges in the Indo Pacific region in close collaboration with Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong and Australian Defence Minister Linda Reynolds, Australian Ambassador Sinodinos, and others. Over the past decade, we've seen technology innovations continue to surge forward at an unprecedented rate. We established the Cyber Statecraft Initiative almost a decade ago to bring operational expertise and strategic foresight together to address these challenges. Today, their work at the nexus of technology and geopolitics sheds light on important global challenges, such as the security of cloud computing and supply chain politics. The Australian government recently released the Australian Cybersecurity Strategy Industry Advisory Panel report, which showcases recommendations that can strengthen public private collaboration on critical infrastructure cybersecurity. Specifically, the report offers up the idea that distributed risk and, of course, distributed responsibility, and how one of the biggest challenges for owners and operators of critical infrastructures is that their cybersecurity and geopolitical risk depends on others, whether they be a cloud vendor, a foreign technology supplier, or a counterpart in a neighboring country, and not solely themselves. This unique predicament makes international cooperation and collaboration a necessity, not a choice. And before we begin today's discussion, I'd like to extend a special welcome to our discussants. In particular, I'd like to welcome Secretary Kirsten Nielsen, a friend and also a leader on security issues, including enterprise risk, resilience, cybersecurity, and critical infrastructure. In 2017, Secretary Nielsen was sworn in as the sixth Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, America's third largest cabinet agency, where she oversaw some 240,000 law enforcement, civilian, and military employees, and I might add an additional nearly 240,000 contractors working within a $70 billion annual budget. And today, as the president and founder of her newest venture, Lighthouse Strategies, Kirsten advises investors and technology companies on strategy, risk, public policy. Kirsten, thanks for joining us. I'm also particularly pleased to welcome Andy Penn, CEO of Telstra, Australia's largest telecommunications company. At Telstra, Andy is leading an ambitious effort to position the company amidst a changing telecommunications technology landscape. Before joining Telstra as CFO in 2012, Andy has had a 40-year career across three different industries: telecommunications, financial services, and shipping. Andy, we're very excited to have you join us virtually today. Andy and Kirsten will be joined by our fearless moderator this afternoon, Brett Winifred, editor with Risky Business. Brett has an extensive background working in and reporting on the key cybersecurity issues challenging Australia and the world. I can't think of a better individual to moderate this conversation. Brett, welcome. And thank you to everyone for your valuable support for our work and for your time this afternoon. And now, without further delay, over to you, Brett.
Thank you very much for that welcome. Is there any opening remarks that either of Secretary Nielsen or Andy wanted to make before we kick into the questions today about your involvement in the industry panel and your work on the critical infrastructure strategy today?
Sure, I might start with a few, and then I'll turn it over to Andy. Let me just start by, of course, thanking Jane for the introduction, and thank you always for your leadership in cybersecurity and all things national security. I want to thank the Atlantic Council I've had the honor to speak at your events and support your events before. As you know, I'm a big fan, and thanks, of course, to the expert panelists. It's my pleasure to share the stage, so to speak, with Andy, who did an exceptional job in leading the Australian Advisory Council. More on that in a moment when I turn it over to him. But I wanted to briefly begin by just framing today's discussion with the complexities of systemic risk, where we've been, where we're headed with critical infrastructure, and of course, as Jane said, the ever-growing need to partner. So it's been said, I've said it, others have said it. Obviously, today's cyber risk is not only global, but it is systemic. And when we look at the increasing convergence of physical and cyberspace, the ability to attack either through the other, the disruption of critical infrastructure functions and services can ultimately have profound effects in both the virtual and physical world. And then you add on top of that growing interdependencies, the Internet of Things or the Internet of Everything, as it might be, and our intense reliance on digital connectivity, which we've certainly seen during this pandemic. And what we start to see are single points of failure. I guess what I should say is we see more than we have had traditionally. We see disruptions that can be caused from concentrated dependencies. And then, of course, we see cross-cutting functionality that can be exploited. If we just look at Zoom or any other digital teleconferencing platform as an example over the last 8 months, we certainly have all seen what happens when we all try to utilize a platform at the same time. So that concentrated dependency itself can become a non-traditional risk, one that we haven't necessarily looked at. The other key challenge with systemic risk, in addition to identifying it, is of course that disruptions will no longer be limited to the original target. We can see widespread cascading effects. They can be difficult to predict or to quantify. We saw an example of this with the malware in 2018. In all instances of the big attacks, they spread well beyond the perpetrator's targets. And there's seemingly innumerable assessments of what would happen to our grid in the US. And of course, an example that I always have top of mind is position navigation and timing systems, which if disrupted would affect, yes, GPS and our ability to get where we're going, but also mass transit, aviation, agriculture, microsurgery, payment settlement systems, the list goes on. So a true disruption could truly have catastrophic effects in multiple sectors. And the reason I give that as a frame is because I want to quickly talk about critical infrastructure before we, Brett, jump into the panel. You know, traditionally in the United States and through most parts of the world, we have focused primarily on protecting individual assets, companies, individual systems, sectors. But what we consider to be critical infrastructure has really morphed over time, appropriately so, from an almost feudal approach of protecting physical places to this expanded definition of assets and key resources, and now, of course, to systems and networks, and to today's work around identifying critical functions. So now, more than ever, we're looking across government, across sectors, across government, private, trying to focus on those nationally critical functions. And Andy will talk a little bit about the systems of national significance term that is used in Australia, but they're the lifeblood of our economy, of our security, of our day-to-day lives. So what I would just offer as we go into today is if we think less about things and places and more about functions, we can begin to better identify those single points of failure, the seams of the vulnerabilities due to the hyperconnectivity, the concentrated dependencies issue, and what can and how it would create ripple effects. I know the National Risk Management Center at DHS is focused on this, and others throughout the US. So is Australia, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But it's a recognition, I think, that not all places, assets, even systems within a given sector are of equal criticality. So we have to look at interdependencies and that hyperconnectivity to determine what is critical. So is cloud critical infrastructure? We've talked about this for a good decade and a half. But I think as time goes by and the speed at which we connect and the innovation cycle increases, I think it becomes more and more relevant question. And of course, what part of cloud, right? Is it the storage? Is it the transmission? Is it the functionality that occurs on the platform? What about space? Australia has listed space as a new area to consider under their critical infrastructure definition. And then I'll just toss out two more. What about data and what about identification? Both of those are always top of mind to me, as I really think data amount and data speed is the currency of tomorrow, if not today. But identification itself, as we move more and more online, the concept to really know who is who, and if they are who they say they are, becomes critical as a function, whatever format that takes, whatever asset, system, network, et cetera, is associated with that. And of course, all of that then leads to how do we partner and how do we identify risk? I think Jane discussed the partner part, as well as I could at the beginning, so I won't belabor it. But I think this work with Australia continues to be very important, and with all of our partners, but perhaps particularly within the Five Eyes community. When I was a security minister, we spent a lot of time talking about that within Five Eyes context. But as we continue to see the rise of hostile nation states, all of this becomes more complex because they seek to attack us in a variety of ways through our digital systems and networks. So how do we agree on what is acceptable? We're way overdue, in my opinion, for advancing responsible state behavior in cyberspace and what those norms are. And then what do we do about it? And we talked a lot in our advisory group in Australia about how to best do that with other nations. So with that, Brett, I'll turn it back to you, but probably Andy wants to say, or Andy, if you could, when it's your turn, talk a little bit about briefly just the advisory council that you led and the work that we did, just so people have perspective of how that tied into the strategy.
Perfect. Over to you, Andy.
Thanks very much, Kirsten, and thanks, Brett, and thanks, Jane, for that kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to join the forum this morning. And I can't think of a more important time to be really double clicking on cybersecurity. The cybersecurity strategy in Australia was the work for it was kicked off around about the middle of last year, and it builds on Australia's inaugural cybersecurity strategy, which dates back to 2016. And of course, even in the time from 2016 to 2020, a lot has changed, and that's what provoked the Australian government to review the strategy for 2020 and beyond. And it also coincided with the announcement by the Australian Prime Minister his aspiration for Australia to develop a digitally leading economy by 2030 in the top 5 digital economies in the world. And of course, what goes hand in glove with that is a cyber secure economy, because in a world of increasing digitization, unless you build the cyber defenses in parallel with that, then clearly those plans are going to be significantly challenged. And so, to Kirsten's point, an independent panel was appointed to help advise the government in relation to the development of that strategy. And I was very pleased to be a part of that panel as the chair, and to be joined by Kirsten and others such as Robin Denholm, who's the chair of Tesla, and Darren Kane, who's the chief security officer of the National Broadband Network, which is the key broadband provider at a wholesale level in Australia, Bob Mansfield, who's the chair of Focus and a long-term expert, and others as well. And so we did the work of which, interestingly, sort of shouldered into that period of COVID. We were about to issue our preliminary report in March, and of course then the world suddenly became aware of the significance of COVID. And at the time, I remember speaking to the government, and the government obviously felt that their priorities had shifted slightly, understandably, to the security and the health of the nation. But we made the point that, of course, as we all start to move to work and study from home, actually cybersecurity was going to become even more important. And so we continued with the work, and we were pleased to issue our report in the middle of the year. And one of the frameworks in the report is really, and I'll come to the point of critical infrastructure in a second, but one of the framings in the report was to acknowledge that ultimately cybersecurity is a team sport. So we all play a role, and we were looking at it through the lens of government, and the role of government, through the lens of business, and also through the lens of us all as individuals. And philosophically, our approach was that from a government's perspective, what was primary importance was the government needed to focus on being an exemplar itself. So in its own systems, in its own operations, in its own government departments, government needed to be a leader in relation to what's best practice cybersecurity. The other role, though, that government needed to play was in relation to critical infrastructure. Those systems of such significance that they ultimately, if they are under threat, pose a threat to the integrity of national security. And how do we increase the powers of government, or rather, how do we increase our ability to collaborate with government to ensure that protection, knowing that many of those systems are actually in private hands, such as telecommunications. In relation to business, our focus was really to make a series of recommendations which were ultimately about ensuring that businesses had a greater degree of responsibility to provide products and services that are cyber safe and cyber secure. And then finally, in relation to individuals, notwithstanding increasing the overall effort by government and the overall effort by business, ultimately individuals would always have a degree of residual risk that they needed to manage themselves. And in that case, therefore, there's a series of recommendations around awareness and good cyber hygiene, as well, and education and support for individuals. So that was the sort of broader framing. On the point of, or rather what I should say is that the government then took those recommendations and issued their cybersecurity strategy, which I'm pleased to say adopted many of the recommendations and the core thrust of our advice in their cybersecurity strategy, which was then published. But then one of the first cabs off the rank was also the publishing of a consultation document in relation to critical infrastructure and systems of national significance, and really recognising, to Kirsten's point, that whilst on the one hand we needed to think about this critical infrastructure through functions as much as through industries, the reality is today the regulatory and the legislative framework is actually in industry structures. And so unless you're going to wholesale change the complete regulatory framework across all of these systems, whether it's banking and finance or food or power or space or telecommunications, which would be a very, very complex and difficult job. The question is, how do we actually take the existing legislative and regulatory frameworks to do a couple of things? One is to increase the level of responsibility of operators of critical infrastructure in relation to their cyber defences and bring those up to a consistent standard, one. And then two, how do we provide the government with the ability to step in and assist in a situation where those systems might become under threat? And the interesting thing is, as Kirsten mentioned, is of course, some of these systems straddle both the private and the public sector. And so and government. And so if I sort of take my own example of telecommunications, what's interesting is the company that I work for, Telstra, was in fact actually 20 years ago owned by the government. It was the national telecommunications provider. The government privatised Telstra 20 years ago, so it's then become into private hands. And then 10 years ago actually renationalised a part of that industry. And so you can see that actually in the provision of telecommunications, the government is not only a regulator, but it is actually also part of the value chain of providing that function. And of course, that can change again. And you see that in power, with a lot of power companies have historically been owned by state governments, and then part of it's been privatised. Things like poles and wires have been nationalised and reprivatised. So we need a system in place that is able to look through industries and across industries, but also look through governance and ownership structures as well. And that's the consultation that we're going through at the moment. But Brett, why don't I pause my comments there and be very happy to open up the discussion.
No worries. I'm glad that we're zeroing in on the critical infrastructure paper, because that's where the rubber really seems to hit the road on what the government wants to get started with out of the cybersecurity strategy and all the recommendations you put forward. We might have previously defined critical systems as those essential to life, predominantly energy, water, gas, that kind of thing. Over time, we lumped in maritime ports, we lumped in telecommunications. But in the latest strategy, it seems to include everything: financial services, healthcare, transport, food, software, and technology services. What do you think prompted Australia to broaden this definition of what critical infrastructure is, what are the systems that we should be focused on, and what conditions have changed in the threat environment that require us to rethink critical infrastructure security. Maybe starting with yourself first, Andy.
I think the simple point, Brett, is that the digital world has extended far beyond where it originated from. And so increasingly, all of these parts of industry, such as banking and financing, have increasingly become digitized. And it's a simple, I think, concept that if you previously look at the world through the lens of the physical world, that has become digitized. And we're moving into a whole new era with the development of this sort of technology of the Internet of Things, which is really simply the point that you can put sensors into physical objects to gather data and actually effectively automate those physical objects. Increasingly more of our world is becoming digitized. And of course, that Internet of Things has also enabled, or rather increased, the potential attack area much more broadly. And so I think that's one dimension. I think the second dimension is also the interdependency, and Kirsten mentioned this, the interdependency of those various different systems. So, for example, earlier in the year, we had a very bad bushfire season here in Australia, and telecommunications is obviously critically important during that in the case of an emergency. And a number of telecommunication systems were impacted and went down. But when you actually looked at it, it was 95% as a consequence of a lack of power that went out. And so the interdependency of the systems is critically important. If you think about agriculture, I was speaking at a regional agricultural forum recently, and the CEO of the Australian Grain Growers Cooperation said to me that their single most important resource used to be water. It's now telecommunications. And that's because actually the irrigation is all automated and it needs telecommunications to be able to support that automation. So I think it's this interdependency in conjunction with the digitization that's caused us to cast the net a lot wider in terms of what constitutes critical infrastructure.
And Kirsten, how does that compare with the US approach that you would have overseen over the past decade or so?
Yeah, I mean, I think we continue to redefine what we mean by critical infrastructure through presidential policy. And then, as I said, at DHS right now, they've moved through, I'll bear the audience all of the acronyms, but we had something we used to call Section 9 entities. We still do, but these were particularly critical as a top line summary. We've moved from that to really looking at critical functions, which DHS is spending a lot of time looking at right now. I mean, just to broaden it, I would say what we don't want to do is fall into a pitfall that because we define something as critical infrastructure, it means we have to regulate it. There are some critical infrastructures in the United States that are not regulated, and the same in Australia. So point one, the two do not have to go together. And I find that a lot of times that's right where the conversation goes, as opposed to really thinking through the criticality. The second thing is roles and responsibilities, which is, Andy talked a little bit about in the report. And if these functions are truly critical, then that means there's a heightened role for both government and the owner and operator of the function. And what does that mean, right? And so what that means for risk management is we have to be much more specific. In my mind, the government should play a larger role in those types of functions with respect to threat. Interdependency modeling is very difficult for one owner operator to have that perspective. Of course, international cooperation. I mean, country government level is much better positioned to work with other countries. And of course, the infrastructure and the way the internet unique, doesn't recognize borders, so to speak. So I think it's consistent. We have a lot of concern in the United States about expanding definitions, changing definitions. So we need to continue to have those conversations with industry and make clear what it means and what it doesn't mean. What I hope it means is that we have a more mature partnership, but not necessarily that we jump into a need for regulation. We might need to around some functions for sure, but the two aren't necessarily the same thing.
I certainly did want to talk to regulation. It's too irresistible for a journalist not to jump into that area. But the 2020 strategy that Australia released places a great deal more responsibility on the state to govern the security of critical systems, as we mentioned, even when those systems are sometimes privately owned. and to respond when those systems are attacked. And as an anecdote, when I wrote a column on this in Risky Business on the subject, I expected a little more pushback from industry on the basis that we are, at the end of the day, proposing some regulation off the back of this. And historically, particularly in Australia, industry has tried to keep the government at arm's length when it comes to regulation with regards to cybersecurity. So I found it a little surprising that how many CISOs told me, both before and after I wrote the piece, that this sort of regulation was something they had openly advocated for. They actually wanted an even playing field. So the first question I wanted to ask either of you to step in on is, in what circumstances do you think the government is best placed to directly intervene in the security of private assets? What's the kind of threshold we should be looking at?
Kirsten, maybe do you want to comment, having sort of looked at this through the lens of government? And
Sure, although I'll turn it over to you quickly, because I know you and I have had lots of conversations. Brett, I mean, this is the age-old challenge, right? How do we regulate and legislate in a environment that is vastly increasing in terms of both innovation and digitization? We do not want to chill innovation. We do not want to handcuff private industry. We don't want risk management to become a security compliance checklist, right? I personally do not think those are useful. They certainly can take a lot of time, but I'm not sure what it helps us know, because it often lacks the context. It lacks the denominator, if you will. There's been X breaches. Okay, what does that mean? You have to tell me more. And by the way, the breach doesn't even matter if we were able to recover and or we had redundancy built in. So the challenge of regulating is finding it, when it's needed, the way to do that. I think what you're describing, and I'll give you another example of facial recognition companies. We see facial recognition companies that design and or use that technology throughout the world asking for legislation regulation. And the reason for that is, as you said, they want to even the playing field, but they also want to be able to demonstrate that they are good corporate citizens. They're doing what they should, and they are abiding by standards of conduct and best practices. So we see some industries moving forward, requesting additional government intervention. The trick is how to do that while making sure it's flexible, it's scalable, protects innovation, protects privacy, and then also it truly goes to the heart of what we're trying to accomplish with risk management. It doesn't become just a checklist.
And Brett, I mean, I would probably add, thanks, Kirsten. I mean, when might the government be appropriate to intervene and take action? And I think, there's a couple of situations, maybe where attacks are nation state sponsored, or another might be where an attack is of such a significant nature and or scale that it actually threatens national security. The challenge, of course, in the cyberspace is you don't necessarily know that you're in one of those moments at that time. And so that's why I think, the collaboration and the cooperation between government and business is incredibly important, because in the physical world, if you're under attack, it's far more obvious. But the point being, and you do reference this, is that many of these systems are actually in private hands. So if there was a very significant attack that threatened national security and it was targeted through, maybe it was targeting some of our power systems or our telecommunication systems, how do we facilitate? Because I'm sure we would all want our maximum defense capability applied to resisting that attack. But if the maximum defense capability is partly in the hands of government, which inevitably, of course, it will be, and who are best placed to deploy that on the one hand, but what's being attacked is actually in private hands, we need a mechanism to enable government to be able to step in and to assist in the defence. And that's what we've got to work through with industry. To your point about not having sort of heard a lot of pushback so far, I suspect when we get to the detail of the legislation, it might start to get a little bit more heated in the debate, because that's really where the rubber hits the road, which is in what circumstances and how might government and or government agencies have the powers to be able to step in and to actually be part of operating a system which is currently run by private hands, such as in telecommunications, and what are the protections for that company in that situation that has liabilities and responsibilities to customers which could be interrupted as a consequence of that sort of involvement, and how do we work together in that situation to ensure the maximum defences. And that's the consultation that's being conducted right now, and submissions I think were due in a couple of weeks ago. So that debate is about to really open up.
I should close my part of the of this teleconference by saying that it's probably best that the journalist in the room says it, but because I'm the best place to say it. But Australian government agencies don't always tend to score well in security audits, and their historical record is probably even worse than some of US government agencies in terms of their cybersecurity posture, despite having the assistance on offer of bodies like the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, who's fairly well respected here. What do you think the government could do today to win the private sector's trust in its capabilities so that the door is going to be open when that time comes that the state does need to intervene? Maybe start with Kirsten based on your experience, and then Andy to close out.
Sure. I mean, this is you've hit on something that's very important. And I think that it would behoove all of government agencies to really give this some thought. I know the Department of Homeland Security and other sector specific agencies spend a lot of time thinking about this. I think it has to be a win-win. Industry has to be able to see that they're getting something from the partnership, not just giving something. And that can take many forms. I'll just use information sharing. We've talked about information sharing for decades, maybe longer than that, but at least for decades in the concept of cybersecurity. And the key there is the government has to be able to demonstrate that the information they're providing is not only accurate and timely, which should be the very, very lowest bar, but that it's tailored and it's actionable. And it has to be something that industry can quickly ingest. It has to be in a way that can occur, whether that's through automated threat indicator sharing or countermeasure sharing, others, such that they can quickly get it and do something about it. We're well past, I'm happy to say we're well past the days when a government agency would call a company and say something to the extent of, P.S., we think there might be a threat against you. We can be much more specific now, but gathering that data, assessing that data, understanding that data, and doing it in conjunction with our partners, because, as we saw, to use the examples of the malware in 2018, again, non-PET included, we saw them propagate across the world as the sun rose, right? So we're all connected. We've got to be able to have close partnerships with other countries to also understand what's happening. So to build trust, you have to give something. You can't just take. That would be my short capture.
And I think what I would say, Brett, is just you referenced the Australian Cyber Security Centre, which is a capability which works through the partnership of the Australian Signals Directorate, which is responsible, obviously, for signalling and intelligence and as part of the overall defence of the country. But it's intended to be a collaborative centre, both virtually as well as physically, that is actually sharing capabilities and sharing information regarding cybersecurity. And through that, it's also building something called the Joint Cybersecurity Centres, of which there are 5 distributed around the country. And these are really facilities where industry and government can share in a protected and collaborative way capabilities and information regarding cyber. And one of the things I observe is that there's a lot of sort of if you like, sort of suspicion, not so much suspicion, but industry often feels governments not being completely transparent in relation to the risks that it's aware of, and that the information is not flowing in. And in my experience, having sort of dealt quite deeply on both sides, actually people are jumping at shadows. Actually, quite often the government or the intelligence agencies may not actually know any more about potential attacks. And in fact, it may be in the industry side where the knowledge is greater, just because obviously they're seeing it firsthand. And so I think the more collaboration, the more engagement, the more sharing that can occur through the vehicle of those cybersecurity centres, the more we can build trust between government, the security agencies, and the private sector to jointly combat this increasing threat. And so therefore, that's why I was particularly pleased to see that the Joint Cybersecurity Centres and the Australian Cybersecurity Centre featured very prominently in the very significant investment announcement that the government made regarding supporting the cybersecurity strategy, where they're spending about 1.7 billion in increasing the defences of the country a significant proportion of which is being targeted through those centres.
Great, great. As much as I'd like to dive into this much further, there is a far larger panel ready to take on further questions. So from here, I'd like to throw it back to Trey, and thank you for inviting me to participate today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brett, and thank you, everybody, for queuing us up for a little discussion of these concepts. Thank you to the panel. Let me introduce our group here quickly, and then we'll get into the conversation. First up, we have Mr. Kurt John, Chief Cybersecurity Officer of Siemens USA. He is responsible for cybersecurity strategy, governance, and implementation for the company's largest market with more than $23 billion in annual revenues. Kurt was also a member of the leadership team that provided guidance on global assurance projects and transparency and improvement recommendations to the Siemens Managing Board. So Kurt, thanks for being here.
Thanks,
Second
Trey.
up, we have Ms. Bobby Stempfli, Vice President and Business Security Officer at Dell Technologies. Bobby's a leader in the field of security and the use of technology to support the public's interest. She serves on the board of the Center for Internet Security and is a senior fellow with us here at the Atlantic Council. Bobby, thanks for joining us. Next up, we have Mr. Alistair McGibbon. Alistair is the former National Cybersecurity Advisor and head of Australian Cybersecurity Centre with the Government of Australia. He's also currently the Chief Strategy Officer at CyberCX. Alistair has both a private sector and government background and previously served as the government's e-safety commissioner, as well as the general manager of security for Dimension Data. Alistair also helped establish the Australian Federal Police's High-Tech Crime Centre during his long stint with the Australian Federal Police. And finally, without further ado, Ms. Jeanette Manfra, Global Director of Government Security and Compliance with Google Cloud's Office of the CISO. Jeanette focused on helping customers, particularly those in regulated industries, build and maintain the highest levels of security and trust into their technical infrastructure and services. Prior to her time with Google, she spent more than a decade serving in various roles at the Department of Homeland Security and the White House, focused on establishing the nation's first civilian cyber defense agency, and is a proud veteran of the United States Army. Finally, my name is Trey Herr. I'm going to be our MC here today. I run the Cyber Statecraft Initiative here at the Atlantic Council and going to get us right into the conversation. So first, for the group, we've had a lot of discussion here in the first 30 minutes about a shifting definition of critical infrastructure, about reevaluating this notion of criticality. Looking at the industry panel report, I'm curious, do you see utility in that shift? And perhaps where are there clear opportunities for evolving policies in Australia to inform US thinking, or vice versa? And why don't we just go right down the line, Kurt, Bobby, Alistair, and then Jeanette.
There we go. Am I coming in okay?
You're indeed.
Okay, good. Absolutely. Look, and there's some, I'm sure we're going to get to some discussions later on to talk about some emerging technologies and how those also could possibly be included in the expanding definition of critical infrastructure. I think Kirsten said it best. With the democratization of technology into so many different areas, it's no surprise that so many different non-traditional areas are being looped into critical infrastructure, food and beverage, etc. And so I absolutely do think we need to focus on getting a clear definition of what critical infrastructure means. And in addition, I think what's really important for the government, both whether it's the Australian government, the US government, we need to be careful of removing, so that we remove duplicative efforts. We want to make sure that we leverage and expand existing standards that a lot of private industry is already using, because that's where the rubber tends to hit the road, which is private industry. And then the government really needs to be a good orchestrator of information sharing and coordination so that our efforts can be aligned.
I think that means I go next. I think for me, the concept of the changing definition, not necessarily an expanding definition, is really important because obviously technology is going to evolve, and the way we as people use the technology evolves. And so really being able to adapt into that is, I think, going to be an important element. The core challenge here, and one of the things I particularly liked about the report, is it started at the objective level, right? It didn't dig right into sort of specific tactical recommendations. It tried to say, I'm trying to accomplish this larger objective. And that I think is very similar to some of the comments that Secretary Nielsen was making earlier, was that let's move above the system and the asset and to the role that this element plays, and think about what and how we might leverage or attach responsibility based on a function that a particular piece of technology or entire sector or region plays.
Well, thanks, Trey. I think I'm next. It's Alistair McGibbon here. Look, I'm a supporter of expanding the number of sectors that are involved here. In Australia, it was actually only 5 that were recognised as critical infrastructure beforehand. And frankly, you know, ports were put on for a particular political reason rather than a logical reason, compared to what is now a much broader definition, there's no doubt. You know, I know we have a few people here who've had extensive experience in cloud, for example. I mean, if the hyperscale cloud providers were to fall over today, the economy of the world would stop. And so to not see them as critical, of course, would just be madness. And yet it's only just this year that the federal government here has said that their criticality means that they have increased responsibilities. Andy made a good point, as did the Secretary. While I agree we should be looking at criticality, including of subsystems inside industries, we need to look at what the regulatory mechanisms are to drive the change. And so I actually support the federal government's current view that sort of describes sectors and then elements in sectors and their responsibilities, because ultimately you need to find a regulator that understands the industry. I'm a former regulator and I'd say I understand industry reasonably well. Most industry would disagree, of course, that the regulator understands exactly the nuances, but you've got to find a close fit between whatever the government entity is and the entities that are being regulated, in order to make sure that the requirements put on, say, electricity generators and transmitters are fundamentally different to the requirements that you might put on a hyperscale cloud provider. So I might just leave it at that.
I think what I would add is to have come from a little bit of what Secretary Nielsen was talking about, and she mentioned the National Risk Management Center at the Department of Homeland Security, something that I worked with her and several others in building that. And my perspective is that, both because of regulatory concerns, a variety of others, is critical infrastructure as a term had been around for a while in the United States, and had it started to become very sort of cemented in its definition of what it meant, and it didn't allow as much fluidity and to be able to manage what is really about managing risk to the country. And that's why very deliberately at the time chose to call it the National Risk Management Center. And so while understanding criticality and having organizing principles for sectors to be able to come together, to be able to work with government, I think that evolution to critical functions and services is really important, and having a conversation both within government about what is the risk to the country, what is the risk to sort of the global systems that your country depends upon, and then to be able to have that conversation with industry. And so becoming more about what does it mean if the scenario of disrupting those critical functions and services, how what sort of things would we be concerned about, what would be the indicators that government could be looking out for that could pass to industry, or if industry had a better understanding of what some of these risk concerns are, that industry could be looking for those things and even sharing internally. So I think in sort of having been at the department for a really long time and seeing different iterations of this notion of critical infrastructure, I really like the notion of a national risk management approach, and having this critical functions and services. Again, sector is very important, and I think you need to have both, because there needs to be some way to organize, just in a frankly practical way. But by having that functions and services conversation, I think it becomes more practical, and the incentives are much more aligned too between government and industry.
So let me come back to that close fit phrase, Alistair, that you used here for a second. So a question to you and Jeanette. As we're looking across this range of potential new sectors that are deemed critical, or at least in the Home Affairs language, have newly defined specific security obligations, what would you expect, or where would you expect government to have a heightened role for specific critical functions or services? And what would that look like? Or maybe what's an example of what that could look like as a successful model? Let's go, Alistair, and then Jeanette.
Well, first, let me say Jeanette's explanation was much more elegant than mine in terms of the need for both these verticals, and then I'd call these horizontals of criticality. Look, it's a vexed question as a former provider of services like Jeanette was and I was to industry. I think there's a very significant role for government and then none at all at exactly the same time. And that's going to sound like I'm contradicting myself. Let me say, I thought the Secretary was right when she said there's clearly a heightened role for government. You know, I started in this space in the equivalent of the FBI running our national response to cybercrime. And pretty much law enforcement's given up on this space, which is a separate discussion I'd love to have with the Atlantic Council, or largely given up. So government has a heightened role. Finally, Australia is recognising that this is a significant existential threat and therefore greater resources, more regulatory process, etc. is necessary. As she said, it's as much about the threat picture, it's about international cooperation, it's about ensuring that we work globally and hyper-locally. But you don't necessarily, of course, want government hands on keyboards of private sector entities. And at the moment, the discussion paper, which is well worth reading, talks about this intervention capability of government to actually get on and protect systems. Now, we all know that you can't protect a system that you're not familiar with, and you don't want a government employee coming in and operating, say, a telecommunications company's systems. In fact, I'd be very scared if that was to occur, even though I sat in that role. I would say that it's therefore the role of government is clearly intelligence, is clearly information, is clearly threat warnings, is clearly exercising, is clearly telling you what the expectations upon you are as a provider, understanding that it's not just your own business, but society that depends upon you. But it's not actually getting hands on keyboards. That does worry me. And Andy Penn mentions this concept of the rubber hits the road when the legislation comes before our parliament. And we'll look very carefully for that definition. Now, the last thing I'd say, Trey, is this. When I sat in the role, I had no authority to compel what I'd say an action or an inaction. I couldn't actually go to one of these critical infrastructure providers and say, you must get this foreign state off your system. You must shut this vulnerability down. I had no authority to do that. So the concept of giving government the authority to compel that type of action might sound crazy to our US audience, but to an Australian, most people thought we had that authority. Giving that authority to government, I think, is good. It might affect the libertarians on the call, but you know, I'm a public order type of guy, so I like it. But don't give me the authority to get hands on keyboards and run a power grid that I've never run before, because I think that's potentially catastrophic, and I don't want to run Jeanette's hyperscale cloud systems either. So I'll throw to her.
Yeah, I think I would agree on the intelligence, and but this is something that's been talked a lot about, and it's really got to be thinking about alerts and warnings. If we're talking about, and the government says we're concerned about these critical functions and services, and working with industry to understand what are those alerts and warnings that people could benefit from to take action off, so we have some sort of early indication perhaps that something's going on, technical or even strategic. So I think that's really important, and being able to have those trusted conversations is hard. Between government and industry really requires an understanding of each other's space and a fair amount of trust. I think there's also two other roles. Alistair mentioned sort of briefly one of them around exercising, and I would kind of even further that into orchestration in sort of, you know, these significant response. And being able to understand that in many cases what we're dealing with in some of the scenarios that Secretary Nielsen talked about and many others, we were not just dependent on US private sector, we were dependent on our partners in Australia, in the UK, in Europe, in Japan. And so, you know, also being able to orchestrate across boundaries when we're sort of collectively trying to defend against something. I also think that the role of standards is very important, and the work that NIST has done in the United States and other sort of standards type agencies within other countries is really important. And being able to set clear standards that people can adopt, whether that's in the cybersecurity framework, the risk management framework, or a variety of very technical sort of controls, is I think a very important power that government agencies can do, because they can be that neutral party. Industry-based standards are also tremendously useful, and want to keep pushing on that. But those would be the two other things that I would think about.
I want to bring Kurt and Bobby in here in a second, but just to push back very gently, Alistair and Jeanette, I mean, one thing that jumps out in terms of the early warning component is the visibility that government has, in many cases, appears to be exquisite with respect threats, far less so with respect infrastructure. And I'm thinking about the Spectre and Meltdown vulnerabilities in the extended period of time where that mitigation was running without direct government intervention, direct government assistance in more than an assistance capacity to try to manage that multi-stakeholder process. How would you see, in sort of a clean sheet picture of the world, how would you see the balance across the categories of risk for where government is leaning forward differently than it is today in order to provide that sort of early warning and insight versus where they're just sitting on capabilities and assets that they already have in place?
I can take that.
I'll respectfully defer to Jeanette on this to start.
Yeah, you could have a whole session on that topic. I think, part government is they're looking at a lot of threats and a lot of different risks. Some of it's not always relevant to the cyber conversation. And that's why I kind of keep pushing on, let's have it be a risk management conversation, so that, conversations or capabilities that are being used to protect against counterterrorism, for example, is linked in with what we're trying to defend against on cyber. I also think that there needs to be more of a recognition, and I do think it is definitely happening, but the power that the private sector can provide intelligence and the work that the private sector can do among themselves, to Spectre Meltdown being a perfect example, as sort of the evolution of hyperscalers and others, where we can really coordinate that independently, push out to hundreds of thousands of customers, and really it's opaque to the end user. The problem they're just solved, and so I think that's also really important, and to think about, when you think about those early warnings and indicators, it's also important to know who can take action, who has what capability. Not everybody has that same level of capability and position within the kind of the internet ecosystem to be able to take action on it.
Trey, I'm conscious of time, but let me just say that I agree completely with Jeanette. What I think is best that we've seen in the last few years is a recognition that industry, and Andy mentioned this, industry sees a lot. I mean, Telstra can see, as the largest telecommunications provider in Australia, granular threats that the government just can't, and that you don't want in a liberal democracy the government to see. The question is how we merge that information such that we have a better understanding of the threat picture. And the last thing I'd say is this: Jeanette's right, this is a risk management exercise. It's a lot less sexy than saying it's a security exercise, because we know that cybersecurity should be called cyber risk management and resilience, which is a longer name, not as exciting, but much more accurate. We're not talking about all threats. We're not saying that the government can do all things and that the private sector can do none. We're actually saying, as Andy said, it's a team sport, and that ultimately we need to find out who's best to deliver the solutions to the broader economy, recognising that our roles extend well beyond those of our own company or our own government entities. But thanks.
And that tees us up really well, because I think that's exactly the kind of complexity we're trying to wrap our head around with respect how the government's role is evolving. So to turn to Kurt and Bobby for a second, two companies with massive footprint in the technology space, building hardware, building software, a whole suite of services. I want to ask you guys how we shift in the United States this definition of criticality and its associated policies in a way that doesn't duplicate frameworks, doesn't create unnecessary new obligations. What's the way to try to build that close fit that Alistair framed? And why don't we go with Kurt and then Bobby?
So I think if we're talking policies and I like the question because it fits in well with redefining, I think to use Bobby's term, or whether you want to say expanding the definition of criticality. I think we need to look at critical infrastructure in two ways. First is there's a fixed set of technology that's available, that's fit together in a very particular way, and different entities use them in different ways to deliver certain things. Siemens, for example, whether it's transportation, healthcare, energy, etc. So there's that part of it, the baseline set of technologies. The other part of it, which I think is where the conversation tends to get a little bit more complicated, is how do we address how entities then take those baseline set of technologies and fit them together and put them somewhere, such as, let's say, a power station. So I think both of those need to happen. I think a lot of it is happening maybe on the consumer side, right? So we see California issuing an IoT law, and other states are considering issuing similar laws as well. But I think what needs to happen at the federal level is a pragmatic approach to both addressing the baseline technology, as well as, to use what everyone else has been saying, the functions such as food and beverage, transportation, energy, which are all made up of a particular set of technologies. If we can get to that definition and get to that level of scrutiny, I think it becomes a little bit easier for us to determine which policies serve as good baselines. How do we expand those policies, hopefully organically, so it's not incredibly disruptive to the industry? And then where does it make sense to build new policies? And most importantly, I would suggest, because a lot of companies such as Siemens are multinational companies, how does the government coordinate and collaborate with other countries such as Australia, Germany, etc., to make sure that the disruption that companies might face while trying to address those policies are as minimal as possible?
Yeah, so my experience from time in DHS to time outside of DHS is one where we tend to focus on putting in place policies at the technical level, and that tends to be the least effective place for really measuring their outcome. And so to make it a non-technical conversation, I think one of the ways we could do it is to start with the end in mind, right? So I do actually really appreciate this idea of risk management and resilience at a function and service level, right? That pivot was profound. And once you've made that pivot, whether you're inside an organization or you're looking at it a region, or you're looking at it within a sector, or you're looking, whichever lens you're looking at it through, you can really start to think about the shared responsibility and the shared realization between entities in order to accomplish that service and function. And then you can decompose the levers of influence to be ones that are industry to industry, because there's a relationship between two companies to accomplish something, or between the public and the private sector. And then there are sort of a range of activities. I think Alistair's comment was really profound. The one that said, when he said he was a regulator and the industry members that he was regulating were confident he didn't understand them, or something to that effect. And I think that need to ensure that all of the parties making risk management decisions are aware of the implications of their decisions and are informed enough to really think about all of the pieces of it, is an area that really needs a lot of focus. One of my experience in government is we oftentimes were held to the standard of the auditor, not to the standard of the right thing to do. And it wasn't because the auditors weren't well-meaning, it was because this was the level of skill that a particular set of individuals that we were dealing with at that moment might have had. And so that's, I think, one of the important ways we've got to think about this.
And if I can just add one more thing there. So I agree with both Alistair and Jeanette. I think historically what's happened when it came to policies is that they've been too prescriptive, specifically for addressing things like auditors. And I think the environment we're in right now is way too complex to have such prescriptive policies. But I still think there needs to be some level of guidance which would allow people to both your points, interpret and address risk in somewhat of a consistent manner. Because in my previous consulting days, it's been very surprising to see how differently people can interpret risk. And this is outside of the realm of the risk appetite of an organization. This is just basically, it comes back to people's skill sets as well, to your point, Bobby.
So I'm going to hijack this, Trey. Look at you.
Go
Just
for
go, just log off. So we're really talking about a principles-based approach to this, right? What's the outcome that we want to achieve? And don't tell me how I have to do it, because you don't necessarily understand the way in which I configure my systems.
Correct.
The flip side, as you were just saying, Kurt, is, you know, I'm, you know, coming from government, and I know Brett's still on here, so I'm conscious of saying this, but, you know, because he was pointing out how bad government could be. Bobby, when you're in a compliance-based regime, and it was about the head of a department or an agency accepting risk, they could literally turn a red dot in terms of compliance into a green one by saying, I accept the risk associated with this. Once risk acceptance was there, it could turn everything green. When you went in to actually have a look at the system, there was a lot of red and amber, very few greens, if any, whenever you went into an agency or a company. So it comes down to understanding that you can't just take risk because you accept risk, and understanding that your responsibility as a critical provider goes beyond the curtilage of your own organisation, your own staff and your own customers, to society more broadly. And if we can get this compact between industry and government that says, we'll go principles based because we know we can't tell you exactly how to configure all your systems. The outcomes we're seeking is a certainty, a resilience, a risk reduction. Right. And if we can partner on that, Kurt, we reduce the sharp edges of cost being driven into industry that's just arcane and unnecessary, but we achieve an outcome for society that we know the most existential threat we're facing, at least from a national security point of view. You know, I'm coming from a small to middle power. You guys might have different view of what existential threats are, but from my side, the most likely threat we're going to have from a national security point of view here in Australia is a cyber-driven one. And it will be caused either by a criminal or a nation state or a mixture of the two. And therefore we've got to aim to reduce that risk, but in a manner that doesn't drive unnecessary cost, that doesn't lead, Bobby, to this concept that we're just doing it for auditors, which leads to no improved security.
So I think, Alistair, the thing that is really vital here is it isn't just that somebody sits at the head of the table and says, I accept that risk, right? Because they aren't actually accepting that risk then, right? They're changing something from one color to another. But then they really internalize and understand what the risk is and can then make the kinds of decisions that are appropriate within the context of that compact, because they understand it. Not, I've got a bunch of red and now I'm green.
Now, can you imagine, and Treya might be jumping to the next question here, but can you imagine how critical this discussion we're having is in the context of the broader ecosystem of thousands, hundreds of thousands of suppliers that come together to make up a solution that, let's say, is running a train or powering critical infrastructure? Right, so that's why I think it's so important. I love the risk-based discussion, and I still think we need guidance. Instead of, let's say, policies, it has a negative connotation. I think we're all policied out, but let's say guidance, which is outcome-based and is not too prescriptive, tells you what, but not how.
Let me ask the group here, because this is a really good conversation we've stumbled into. I love outcomes-based, you know, and we shall so stipulate. God knows we've heard the phrase enough here in the last couple of years, but there's a complexity embedded in that, where if I'm defining the outcome and allowing industry to define how they achieve that outcome, that's great, assuming a certain amount of maturity, security engineering awareness, and honesty and transparency on the part of that vendor and a part of that private sector entity. There's a risk, especially with this diffusion of criticality, that we start to get into industries that don't necessarily have that same level of awareness and communication. So starting with Jeanette and wrapping back around, I'm curious, where is there a better point of balance between just outcomes-based, go forth and conquer, and this very prescriptive architectural approach?
I think I agree. It's a really good conversation. I think there's a few ways to sort of look at it. One kind of goes back to what I was saying about capability, and there are some sectors, critical infrastructure sectors in the United States, that have hundreds of thousands of providers, many of them in rural areas with very, very limited resources. And their favorite line is, "My IT guy also cuts my lawn," and they legitimately are operating something critical. And so the idea of having a point solution that's going to be able to work at every single one of these assets and these organizations, it's not going to work. And but you do need to get a certain level of standard, a baseline, I think, that people need to get to. And of course, in my view, I think that means let's not have everybody building their own and operating their own systems. Let's benefit from more scale, which is kind of leads to the second sort of part of it is scale. And there's a real opportunity when you think about sort of the evolution of the internet, how the market dynamics and the ability, and I know we mentioned cloud, but other aspects of it as well, is when you have companies where, like Google, as security is deeply, deeply embedded. We have big incentives for it to be the case. And so having that sort of that dynamic where you're establishing that baseline of what does that standard of care sort of look like, and that every business, if whether you're considered critical infrastructure or not, frankly, because everybody's holding some sort of data that is valuable to somebody. And so what's that baseline? And then really start to look at your specific risks. Don't try to, the point of risk management is to be able to have a bit of a balance. And so really understand, what are those risks that I'm most concerned about? How can I scale a more secure, resilient, reliable sort of solution under that? And then I think you're having a different conversation with those organizations that are part of managing those more unique risks.
Alistair, throw to you, sir.
Oh, thank you. Oh, you're doing it in reverse order. I thought we were going around the clock. My mistake. It's the Southern Hemisphere thing. Hey, so I'm going to say this. While I've talked about us having a sort of a risk-based, sort of very free market view, I'm going to bring the former regulator in me here and say, have consequences for failure. So the carrot to industry should be, we're not going to go hardcore telling you exactly how to configure everything. I'm not going to tell Siemens, I'd give it a crack. Kurt, but I'm not going to tell you how you should put your stuff together, because you guys make good money doing that. But what I was saying to you is, I think there are increased obligations upon directors and officers. So for anyone following along at home, if you went to the 2020 cybersecurity strategy in Australia, my favourite paragraph, and Andy Penn knows this, is paragraph 36 of the strategy. Buried deep in it, a little oblique reference to this concept of increasing the fiduciary duties for directors and officers. So obligations for those who run organisations and who make decisions, the boards and the senior leadership. And that's how our societies, both collectively, actually mature. We say, go forth and prosper. Let's have an economy and a democracy that to some would look quite anarchic, but there are consequences for your failure. I think we need to have both sides. We loosen one bit, but say let's agree on a compact that has our objective. On the other, if you fail, if you take too much risk on, if you make decisions that are just not defensible to a reasonable person, the courts will decide that there are consequences. And the second point is supply chain. Increasingly now, organisations, government and private sector, realise, to Kurt's point, there are thousands of companies, I guess, that come together to make a train. You're one of them, and you will increasingly expect your peers who are in industry with you, whether they're suppliers to you or you're a supplier to them, or you're just co-participants in a project, that you all raise all boats. And I think that's how we balance this more free market view towards regulation. We know we can't legislate or standardize in a way we used to because technology is moving too fast. So we're obliged to move to this more loose definition of expectation. But the consequence, the alternate side is just a bigger stick. And I think that the rational market will actually set where good is. And one last thing I'd say is this before I throw back to you guys is, again, if we accept that this isn't binary, you're secure or insecure, and we accept the fact that no matter what best efforts you take, there are going to be failures because it's just the reality of complex connected systems, then we're not going to punish people for getting it wrong. We'll punish people for getting it egregiously wrong, where it could not be predicted, where it couldn't be expected. And that's just risk management. We just need to put an emphasis, a spotlight on it for boards and officers to lift their game. Over to you.
Yeah, so having forgotten what the original question was, Trey, I'm just going to pivot off of Alistair's comment because I think one of the things that is very true in the cyber risk and resilience problem space and in the sort of cybersecurity problem space as well, is this assumption that if you have a bad outcome, you made a bad decision. And that isn't always the case, right? You can make the best systemic risk management decisions, the smartest ones that other experts would have made under the same set of circumstances, and the adversary gets a vote, or the hurricane gets a vote, or whatever the set of actions or activities could happen. And so really trying to think about this in that way of articulating what a good set of decisions might look like, what kinds of data might you need in order to make those decisions to keep with that sort of that compact, I think is really important. And to break this philosophy that if you have a bad outcome, it had to have come from a bad decision somewhere.
So Trey, remind me what the question is, because I also forgot.
Just speak. Just make it up, Kurt. That's all I did. It's all right. Don't tell anyone.
Ditto then to what everyone else said.
You've lost control, Trey.
Yeah, no, I think
Bobby made a really good point too. Is we've been talking a lot about like prevention, and the fact is that you can't prevent everything, and so part of risk management also means building that. What are you going to do when you did all the right things and the bad thing still happens? And yeah, so I think that's just a really important point to
I will mention a couple of things. I think, and it's coming back to me now, I think there's some existing levers which we can already use to help manage this risk situation that we're dealing with. Look, with the advent of machine learning, AI, 5G, edge computing, cloud, the hyperscalers are going to become super critical for next year's and the next decade's critical infrastructure. And so having deployed a set of controls within the hyperscalers, I think covers a broad swath of some things we would be concerned about. But at the end of the day, there's still some work that needs to get done. I think what I will say, the one thing I will say is we need to be careful not to try to fix what is happening now in the next year or two, right? We didn't get here overnight. It's going to take a while. We just need to be intentional and strategic with how we go about remedying the situation.
Yes. And not to be a Pollyanna, because I'm actually not, believing, finding ways to monitor those decisions, right? Those risk decisions, and be transparent about it, I think helps offset this idea that something might go awry and we might not know.
So we're going to go to audience Q&A here in just a second. So if you've got burning thoughts on risk management, which is our new theme of the panel, we'll just go ahead and rename the entire initiative to cyber risk. If you've got questions, feel free to pop them in. But Kurt, you've teed up the question I've been waiting to ask all day, so I want to get this in before we go to the audience.
Okay.
Talk about cloud for a second. One of the big notions that we've seen evolving but came out really clearly in the Home Affairs consultation paper is the idea that cloud could be defined as a sector with particular criticality, right? Its dependence across different infrastructures, as well as just the complexity of the stack in a cloud provider itself. So let me ask Bobby, Kurt, and Jen in particular, as we're discussing the shift from traditional critical infrastructures and we're potentially evaluating cloud computing to be added to that list, how should we think about the criticality of cloud services and or their use by traditional critical infrastructure? So cloud as critical or cloud as depended on by others who are critical.
I think those are the same thing. Cloud is incredibly critical. Look, in the 1960s, when the internet was launched, no one had any inkling about the type of business models that we will be able to deploy, the way the economy would shift, how easy it would be to give people access to the economy. With AI, machine learning, 5G, and edge computing, all supported by cloud, I don't think today there's anyone who can define what the economy would look like in the future. I think we're going to see drastically new, never thought before business models. And so when you get a set of technologies supported by cloud that are so pivotal to our economic future, cloud is, in my opinion, one of the fundamental things that are going to secure our economic future. And so I think when people, as we in the private sector, as the government, as organizations, standard setting bodies go about thinking of cloud, it's much more than just someone else's computer. It really is going to be the baseline for a brand new future.
I have a problem at a definitional level, and so that sort of this piece that I struggle with here. This idea of hyperconvergence, of data aggregation, of data processing and manipulation as an outsourced function, right? In there, I think is just one example of a set of technologies that are coming that we're going to have to think about how they impact the definitions of critical infrastructure and the economy writ large. And I think we have models for how to think about them. I think we've got to be creative about the application of those models. They're not because they are these providers are they cross sectors in their roles, and so we've got to really think about what are the right standards, policies, principles to use in order to engage. And so it is the future, and it's interesting the way that different nations are really approaching this situation. And I think to some work both that you did, Trey, and that Alistair commented on, I think the supply chain elements of this are an additional area to really explore.
I think, I have a lot of feelings on this. And I think that one, to Bobby's point about definitional, there's cloud can mean a lot of different things. So I'm going to sort of characterize my thoughts and from a hyperscaler perspective. I would say first, there's you cannot get through a cloud briefing right without that slide on shared responsibility, but it's really important. And to understand, what that means in real life is a deep amount of trust that needs to be built. And working with our customers in the public sector and in other sectors, where you're doing very critical, potentially storing critical data, processing critical workloads, these sorts of things. And so having a clear articulation of who's responsible for what, and having that conversation continue in a trusted environment, and being able to understand the risk posture of a customer, or even more broadly, how that risk might be sort of manifested beyond what the customer is. So I think that's really important. I also think that there's tremendous benefit. Main reason that I came here is the report also talks about modernizing legacy technologies. And in my previous role, and Bobby knows this very, very well too, is just spent an inordinate amount of time dealing with legacy systems and vulnerabilities of legacy systems, the cost of legacy systems that actually prevented the continuing operations and maintenance of those legacy systems, preventing future investments to actually modernize. And so there's been a lot of work trying to modernize IT. I think always stuck with me many years ago, a CAIO of a big agency said once, he's like, most agencies don't build and operate their own planes. They trust other people to build and operate planes, even though we use planes all the time. And really, I think there's a lot of benefit to that shift, even though it can be challenging and that transformation can be hard, particularly for security professionals that are used to having this sort of, put clear in quotes, but a perimeter that they defend and they know how to do it. But I think there's a lot of security benefits actually that come with agencies going to the cloud and being able to rely on those that can provide that security at scale and frankly at a cost that otherwise wouldn't be able to be afforded. That doesn't mean that it's not risk, that there's not risk there. It's just, it's not as if there's an entirely new set of risks now that I have to deal with. It's just a different way of looking at it. And there's things that will get better, and there's things that you want to consider as more and more critical infrastructure and public sector entities get that benefit of cloud. But I think, and I think the report talked about this, is government agencies and critical infrastructure typically are very behind in their technology, and they tend to be isolated from the benefits of commercial security improvements, the rapidity and scalability of being able to patch these widespread vulnerabilities. You talked about Spectre and Meltdown. So that I think sort of overall, it's hard to just sort of say cloud as if it's this one monolithic thing, and that the same kind of issues and conversation would apply to the entire industry that characterizes itself as cloud. And but I think people need to understand the benefits, both the mission benefits as well as the security benefits, and have a thoughtful conversation about what that risk looks like.
It's a fair point in terms of that cost benefit trade-off. I think what's interesting, and for another time potentially, is where that benefit to cost ratio is locked in, right? Where there's maybe a little bit less flexibility or fungibility in the technology stack that you use as even as a small to medium-sized user. And for anyone interested in cloud, very quick plug, please check out the CyberStatecraft website for a quick primer. Dude, where is my cloud? With graphics and some associated explanations for what exactly we're talking about when we mean this. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I want to go to the audience quickly. From Tim Aldrich, do you think government and private companies can agree to definitions of critical? And can that also define due diligence for each of these different sectors? So I want to focus in on that first part for the group. Where do we see the most likely overlap for what criticality is between private sector and public, and where are we just talking in different levels? Kurt, why don't we start with you?
I think DHS, the CISA organization, or the DHS, did a fantastic job, right? Because all of the critical functions that they captured, I think we're up to 17 now, if not 19, one of the two, were things that can have a direct impact on the economy and people's lives. So I think there you'll see a heavy overlap with the private sector, right? Because the private sector is in the business to do business, and keeping the economy going is where, you know, we find it very important. Of course, protecting our way of life. Where I think you might see differences is typically for suppliers of the federal government or any type of governments, right? Because sometimes the requirements there may be onerous for smaller and medium-sized enterprises. So I think there needs to be more collaboration, whether through industry associations, sector coordinating councils, in order to get a better definition of what it means to be as secure as possible. Because I agree with Alistair, I think it was Bobby that said it, there's no secure, unsecure, it's just, it's a continuum.
So I think from my time at DHS, and Jeanette lived this directly, that there are a number of really powerful forums between government and industry that are about coming to terms with what common objectives are and where disagreements are. And having watched them, having lived them and watched them, they are not always comfortable dialogues. And they're not always comfortable dialogues because there's agreement and disagreement, and there's wrestling that goes through it. And so things like the NIST cybersecurity framework are examples of where government and industry have come together and said, this is what we want you to think about. So this is how we want you to think about and measure and track your progress. And that wasn't a government direction of this is what we're going to do, and it wasn't an industry saying this is all we want to do, or this is we want to do this much, or we want to do this much more. It was a really open dialogue and conversation. And the work that the National Risk Management Center did in the National Critical Functions was also a dialogue as well. Is it perfect? Probably not. I mean, I think there's great opportunity for continuing to evolve in that space, particularly given that what is critical in any one country, what is critical infrastructure or critical function in any one country, rarely is completely dependent upon things that exist inside the boundaries, borders, or influence or control in that nation. So thinking about how we handle this from an international context, I think is an important next step.
Yeah, I think, just expand on what Bobby said, is that I think government and industry have proven that they can agree at a high level of, the criticality of certain functions and services. Probably where it will continue to be challenging is as you sort of drill into it and you start to look at, well, what does that entire value chain look like for the delivery of that service? And having conversations with vendors and the sort of that end asset, if you will, the more traditional critical infrastructure and how that's delivered in roles and responsibilities. I think that is a useful conversation, and but yeah, I do think that both at the high level there's already been agreement, and I think the continuing conversation and the continuing trust and the continuing seeking to understand what each other are concerned about, and why a government agency has this particular risk concern is really important, because on the industry side, if you're not understanding that, you may be actually missing something that is useful for you also to be concerned about. So yeah, I think we definitely will need to continue to work on it. But it's also important that in the end, at a certain point, decisions have to be made. And right now, this is a national critical function set that we're going with, and then kind of continue to evolve that in those open conversations.
I thought I'd just round out by saying it was interesting, Brett mentioning that when he wrote his piece on this. I don't want to channel what he was thinking, but perhaps an overreach of government, and that industry in Australia turned around and said, yeah, that's kind of what we were asking for. In my experience, industry wants a level playing field. It wants to know where it stands. It wants to know if there's going to be a regulation, what that regulation is, so it can get on with achieving that outcome. Hopefully it's not an onerous regulation, that it's a sensible one. I agree with everyone on this, that in this last section here, who said that there's actually a really significant dialogue that happens regularly between the cybersecurity functions of government and the cybersecurity functions of industry. And that's really important. I think success in terms of agreement looks something like industry feeling some pain, but not a huge amount. Because I think there's been a market failure here. If I'm being blunt, I would have hoped we would have fixed this as a community already, at least got to a steady state of cybersecurity risk. I don't think we're there. So I do think there needs to be pain pushed into industry and to government, frankly, that itself needs to lift its game. It has to, the phrase I'd use, eat its own dog food, right? So if it's going to push cost onto, some people drink their own champagne, but I call it dog food. Let's just say that we've got to, government has to live up to the expectation it's going to push on industry. That's going to hurt, by the way. And that's not a bad outcome. If all of us feel a bit of pain as we lift this most critical part of our economy to protect our citizens' lives. That's what we expect governments to do. That's what we expect critical infrastructure providers to do. And the fact that we're even talking about this now is a great sign.
That's a very positive and unusually uplifting note, I think, for us to end on, especially after a long and thoughtful diatribe on understanding and clarity around regulatory expectations. It's obviously been a particular struggle here in the States over the last few years. Kurt, do you want to jump in quickly?
Oh, no, go ahead.
So I want to be respectful of folks' time. We're right at and just over. So thank you very much to our panelists and for everybody who attended. I think in particular, the message I'm taking away from this conversation, so some work for us to do, is we have already a relatively comfortable expectation that criticality is not every sector and is also not just these 2 or 3 sectors, that there is this tremendous amount of interdependence. And I like the models that got proposed through in terms of thinking about sector-specific duties of care, maturity models with respect how firms approach these issues, as well as raising that big stick and thinking about the fit between coercive efforts and collaborative efforts from government. One thing I will challenge folks walking away from this to think about is, as we look at the report, the industry panel report from Australia, where are there some easy wins to pull over to the US? Because there's some interesting work that's been done. Is obviously a very concerted effort in line with the strategy. How can this inform potentially the next 100 days, the next 10 months, the next 4 years, and thinking about the way the US is addressing this? But with that, thank you to each of our panelists and the attendees. We appreciate everybody joining. This cast will be available on the web in perpetuity as long as you can access the American version of the internet in some future year. Thanks everybody who are joining us. Start your evenings, start your mornings. We'll see you again soon. Take care.